Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. Today we're going to be talking about the upcoming presidential election in France. And our guests are William Drozdiak, a global fellow with the Wilson Center's Global Europe program, who previously served as foreign editor and chief European correspondent for the Washington Post, among other things. He's also the author of the book, The Latest President of Europe, Emmanuel Macron's Race to Revive France and Save the World. Also joining us, Stephen Kramer, who is also a global fellow with the Wilson Center's Global Europe program. Stephen was a professor at the National Defense University for 30 years and also served as a consultant or an advisor to the U.S. Department of State. Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Hi.
Pleasure.
So I want to begin, if we can, with current events, and then we'll look ahead to the election. But currently, Mr. Macron has inserted himself into negotiations with Vladimir Putin and Russia over the standoff with Ukraine. And William, you wrote the book, and you also have commented beyond the book on Macron's ongoing courtship with Vladimir Putin. Talk to us about this gambit on his behalf and whether or not this will be a significant factor in the election.
Well, his courtship of Vladimir Putin really dates back to the start of his presidency in 2017. During the course of conversations I had with him, he said he was persuaded that Europe could only have a lasting and stable security order by reaching some form of reconciliation with Russia. So he has invited Putin as his first state visitor to Versailles. He's carried on this personal relationship with him off and on for these years, and now has tried to insert himself as the primary mediator in peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. But all of this effort has so far produced very few results. Nonetheless, Macron has insisted that the diplomatic track is absolutely vital and that Europe needs to be playing an active role to defend its own interests rather than seeing big powers like Russia and the United States make decisions that could profoundly affect the fate of the European Union.
Thank you. Stephen, I looked back at the interview that you and I did together in May of 2017 when Macron had just been elected. And the first question I asked you then was whether there were any surprises in the election. And your answer was essentially something like nothing but surprises. As you look at the current landscape for the upcoming April election, what do you see?
Well, it's easy to try to predict who's going to win. But I think the most important thing, we're going to find out who's going to win. The most important thing to do is look at what this election tells us about France. And it tells us some very serious things, namely that the French political system, in some ways, the party system is like a city that's been bombed. The two great parties that alternated in power for 50 years, the Republicans, once the Gaullists, and the socialists have collapsed, totally collapsed. And it's not obvious if they'll ever be reconstructed. And Les Républicains is in big, big trouble. They have a little chance this time, but it doesn't look like it's going to work very well. The public is very disaffected with the political system. You had the Gilets jaunes phenomena. That was a really serious thing that threatened the survival of the government. You have increasing violence against elected officials. You had an abstention rate in the last regional elections of 75%. And so what the election is telling us is that there are big problems that France is facing. We're not the only democracy that's having difficulties. I think that's something which...
Sorry, I don't want to step on your words, but that's definitely something I want to revisit in a minute. But I want to share with both of you a headline from the Times of London. Unpopular as he is, President Macron is leading a field of candidates noted for their extreme views or lack of them. And then a poll says 60% of the country disapproves of Macron, yet he's on course to become the first president to be reelected since Jacques Chirac in 2002. Gentlemen, what can we make of this? When we see these kinds of numbers in a US election, it usually means that we're looking at a landslide. What's happening here?
Well, like the French are perpetually unhappy with their leaders, and Macron has always joked about this, but it's true. And even though the economy is probably doing better than anywhere else in Europe right now, there are all sorts of social and other pressures within the society that are breaking apart that Stephen alluded to, notably the discontent with a lot of the population about immigration issues, which has pushed the political discourse much more to the right. That's why you've seen the rise of these a far-right challenger in Eric Zemmour, and also the continuing challenge posed by Marine Le Pen. But Macron himself has also become much tougher on immigration because he sensed the mood of the people. But I think that what he's doing now in terms of the intercession in the Ukraine crisis makes him look more presidential than the other candidates. And I think that will help his cause. As Stephen has pointed out, it is a risky endeavor, but nonetheless, I think he will get points with the French voters for making the effort to try and steer the Ukraine-Russia crisis toward a peaceful resolution.
I think that what Macron is doing is truly statesmanlike. I mean, he's trying to provide Putin with an off-ramp to avoid an outright invasion of Ukraine. So and no one else can do it because it's as if everyone else has chosen sides and can't move from very rigid positions. So it's the only way out. The idea of this Minsk agreement and the Normandy format is really good. I'd also say that I think Macron did that because he's a statesman. When you take a look at the other candidates, it's hard to imagine Eric Zemmour or any of those people representing France. I mean, there's not one of them who could pass for a statesman. So by just doing his job, Macron is also, helping his election. Now, in terms of your comment, only 40% support. You don't need 40% to get into the first round. Remember, there are many, many candidates. 25% should get Macron into first or second, and then he'll be faced with someone who potentially would be very easy to defeat, if all things being equal. So I don't think those figures mean the same thing in France as they would in the United States with only two candidates.
Now, neither of you mentioned Valérie Pécresse, who most of the polls would indicate if there were an election held today, she would be the Macron opponent in a runoff. What do we need to know about her?
Well, I would say that she would be the most formidable opponent that Macron would face in a runoff. But she's also having problems in terms of pulling her party together behind her. She's said a number of contradictory things. So I think that in the end, Macron's experience will help him prevail.
Yeah, Pécresse is a real disappointment, I think, for the right, because, what Macron has been most concerned about is a strong conservative candidate who's not an extremist, so not Le Pen or Zemmour. A person like that could bring votes back from the far right, could take votes from the center. A lot of Macron's support comes from the right. So that kind of candidate could be formidable, but she hasn't quite figured out what she's running about. And so, it's not that far away from the election. So all things being equal, she's going nowhere. And it's not, she could come in third. Marine Le Pen could come in second. Even unlikely, Eric Zemmour could come in second. I don't think so. So, I think, as Bill was saying, Macron is in a pretty good position at this point.
So you mentioned, she doesn't know what she's running about. And Bill, you mentioned immigration as a major concern in the electorate's minds. Are there other issues that are significant, or is this more sort of about a mood or an attitude?
Yeah, well, people are concerned about the cost of living because the same thing is here, inflation. They're concerned about, social system. They're concerned about the fact that lots of people who are not well off are living on very minimal pensions. So a lot of issues. COVID has produced a huge anxiety in all societies. I mean, it can't always express itself. But I think that, there's the Gilets jaunes proved that there's a lot of disaffection from huge numbers of people who never before were involved in politics or demonstrated or did anything. So yeah, I think there are a lot of problems. Macron's done some really smart things. First, he backed off on some of his major changes because of COVID, including retirement reform. My God, that is not something you want to touch close to an election. And he did something also pretty clever about COVID. And he said basically, I'm not sure if I can use vile language, but he basically said, I shit on the opponents of the vaccine. Well, that wasn't bad because there are only 10% of the population that hasn't been vaccinated. A large part of the population is furious at these people because they're responsible for the continuation of the epidemic. And basically, he put all his opponents in a difficult position. What are they going to say? And they never quite figured out the right thing to say. So, I mean, that's playing dirty, but it's very smart. I mean, Macron is a smart guy,
Yeah, and he's also very nimble in the way he responds to challenges. I mean, take the Gilets jaunes question. That was ignited by a policy to move the country away from consuming diesel fuel in order to answer those who were worried about global warming and carbon emissions. And of course, it caused an eruption of protests among the rural population who have to drive. And in France, diesel fuel is cheaper than regular gasoline. So when he was taken aback by that, because he thought this was a sound and sensible policy, answering those who wanted more action on the global warming front, he then went around the country, said, okay, I need to talk to these people. And really, it was a multi-month exercise in self-abasement. He would stand in front of crowds for as long as 6 or 7 hours, taking all of their criticism on board and responding to it, and telling them, trying to teach the population about the difficulties of governing in a society where there are contradictory forces at work. And I think that helped him alleviate or diffuse the crisis, even though it didn't necessarily win him the support of his critics.
Sean, can I bring something up? Because I think
Certainly.
it's really, really important, and it's very scary to me. A lot of the election is about immigration. But when people talk about immigration, they don't mean people coming from Portugal or Spain. They mean Muslims from North Africa. And when people talk about immigration, it's not only about immigration, it's feeling very unhappy about some of those people who are there, namely millions of them. And, someone like Le Pen has been very careful in her language, but basically, she doesn't want any more immigration of Muslims. And I don't think she'd like them to stay. Zemmour has basically gone farther. He is talking about the great replacement. This is the theory that is really very well known in France, that there's a plot by elites together with Muslims to change the nature of the population in France and make it into a Muslim country. This is insane, but the same kinds of crazy ideas were there in the 19th century about Jews taking over. Because it's crazy doesn't mean it's not powerful. And Zemmour is talking about, expelling or getting rid of the Muslim population in France. The name of his party it comes from the Spanish Reconquista, which was when the Catholic monarchs took over Granada in 1492. First, they expelled the Jews, and then they, basically made Islam illegal in 10 years and converted everybody allegedly This is a scary kind of thing. And so what he and then, here's a man who comes from a Jewish background who lies about what happened during Vichy. He says that Pétain tried to protect French Jews. Hardly, considering how many of them ended up in the gas chamber. He's a dangerous man. And the fact that there's so much enthusiasm, even by 13-14% of the French population for this guy, that he makes Le Pen look like a statesman and a moderate, it's really very scary about France. All the ideas, and where's the government? The government talks about Islamic separatism and so on. It's taking the same kind of thing. Who stands up against that? Well, not the left, because the left isn't capable of standing on its own 2 feet. And so you have a horrible kind of almost racist Islamophobic dialogue. It really is worrisome.
Some of these trend lines that Stephen just talked about, Bill, the rise of nationalistic voting blocs within countries, the closed border mentality, propaganda and disinformation that has taken views that usually lived on the fringe and made them more mainstream. I'm wondering, and another rise of authoritarianism, right, is another thing that we've been tracking around the globe. Does the French election, is it indicative of larger currents within the EU? Should we look at it that way?
Well, I think the demographic pressures have been evident for at least a couple of decades now, all across Europe. There are fewer and fewer children, more and more pressure on young people to pay for the social welfare state that exists across much of the European Union. So as a result, it plays into the hands of populists who are warning about the dangers of immigrants coming in, as Stephen pointed out, the great replacement fear. And you see in some countries, Portugal, Spain, which had been previously inoculated against the rise of right-wing extremism because of previous fascist dictatorships that existed before the democracies there. And they have now had a big surge in terms of the voter support for anti-immigrant, xenophobic far-right parties. Now, other places like Italy, the appeal of the Liga, which had reached as much as 35% of support, has drifted downward because of the moderate prime ministership of Mario Draghi. So it is fluctuating. Germany, the far-right Alternative for Deutschland is now is still the third largest party in the country. It's only 10 or 11% support, but it still has a presence in parliament. And these are dangers and risks that are very close to the surface. And if there's an economic recession that should happen, then we could see them once again exploit this and achieve perhaps power in some of these countries.
Mm-hmm.
Again, we don't need to look beyond our own borders to know that polls aren't always right and elections contain surprises. But if things hold as they appear to be and Emmanuel Macron were to be reelected, is he the heir apparent to the Angela Merkel leadership of the EU, unofficial leadership of the EU chair?
Well, at the moment, Scholz doesn't look very strong because the nature of his coalition, because of his difficulty in coming up with a clear position on Ukraine. But then again, Germany is a big country, has a huge industrial base, and France doesn't have it. And often the Germans and the French have sort of shared leadership. France can do it more on international affairs and on military affairs than Germany. But I don't think at this point one country is going to dominate Europe. But Macron has been he's done a good job. I think he's done.
Yeah, and I think he will, if he does get reelected, he will make the rebuilding and revival of Europe the major priority of his second term. Ever since he came into office, he has shown himself to be the most pro-European president in recent French history. In fact, I titled my book "The Last President of Europe" because he's been the only leader in Europe that has been espousing the kind of ideals and values and policies that the founding fathers of the European Union after World War II were promoting. Angela Merkel, for all of her skills and talents, was a very cautious, somewhat skeptical leader in terms of where she wanted to take Europe. She actually pursued policies of economic nationalism based on Germany's mercantile interests. Yeah. And Macron, while he's been impetuous because this is his first job as an elected leader, he, I think, wants to push Europe forward because, as he told me in my interviews with him, unless Europe can stand up and defend its own interests against the superpowers like the United States, China, and Russia, there's a risk that the European Union will be carved up and basically end up disappearing in the course of history. And he really is motivated by that fear.
Gentlemen, before we close, and thank you for all the insights that you provided into the election and to Emmanuel Macron. I want to ask you, I want to go fishing. I want to ask you, what haven't we talked about that you'll be watching? I'm not going to ask you for a prediction. That's not what we do here at the Wilson Center. But what are the things you'll be tracking and that you'll be paying close attention to in the weeks leading up to the election and then at election time itself? Stephen, can we begin with you, please?
John, I think that I'll be waiting to see if something unexpected happens. And I can't tell you what that unexpected kind of thing would be, but that's the way it has been in French politics. Remember that the fact that Macron became president or ran for office was a completely unexpected thing. I think the most important thing, aside from who wins, to my mind, is does Pécresse come in second? Because if Pécresse comes in second, there's a chance that her party will be rebuilt. If it doesn't happen, I think Les Républicains is going to come apart. And then you're left with no alternative party. See, Macron has done brilliantly in terms of demolishing his opposition. But when you win like that, you're faced with a political situation where there's a party based on one man that isn't very structured in the country, and all the other parties are basically gone. It may not be very healthy for the future of French democracy.
Yeah. I would pay close attention to the potential impact of what happens with the Russia-Ukraine crisis. There's no question that this is going to have profound implications for the European Union at large, because already there's a lot of criticism within the EU. Why is Europe a bystander? And when facing the risk that this could be the first major continental war since in the post-Cold War era. And the fact that whether Macron was successful or not, it may not damage his presidential re-election possibilities all that much, but certainly his efforts are very welcome, I think, and they're being coordinated closely with the Biden administration. So if he can succeed in getting through to Putin and convincing him that the risks of an invasion will be costly, not just for Europe, but also for Russia, then I think that will show that he has evolved into a true statesman.
Gentlemen, thank you. I should put it, I feel compelled to put a timestamp on our discussion. You know, when Stephen said that he's not sure what the unexpected might be, we're recording this discussion in February. The election is in April. And, you know, as they say, a couple months in politics and electoral politics can be a lifetime. So certainly viewers should keep their eyes open as we will. William Drozdiak, Stephen Kramer, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And to our viewers, hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.